we're going to talk a little bit about NDR service and how to select a provider. On the call today, we've got a couple experts. I'd say probably the three of us combined is approaching 100 years in probably technology. But both presenters today definitely are experts in this field, much more than myself. Before we get started, let me just mention our disclaimer. We're not going to talk about anything future looking, but just in case, it's not a commitment by Enable by any means. But I know, based on my history, worked at an MSP for 8 years, but 10 years ago and bringing us to today, things have changed a lot, right? And what we're going to do is talk about those and then how you need to make sure you select the right MDR service. So I'm going to let Marco take it away and then Mark, but have a good session, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that. Yes, and Mark definitely more experienced than myself, but I've been in the space for close to 15 years. I've worked with MSPs for about 10 years of that. So what we wanted to do today, and I'll sort of set the stage, is obviously, cybersecurity has changed over the last 10 years, especially with COVID, right? So the vectors in which threat actors can get into, with everyone sort of moving to remote workforce and a lot of customers now moving from on-premise to a cloud infrastructure, right? Challenges are changing and cybersecurity landscape is changing. New threats are evolving. So what Mark and I wanted to do here today was just give you some of the top tips and maybe questions you should ask yourself as you're evaluating bringing MDR into your stack. And obviously the challenges that we've seen is increasing cybersecurity threats, right? This is sort of a no-brainer, right? Over the years, things are changing, things are evolving, and it's a challenge for MSPs to keep up, right? Because one, they don't have the people or the expertise on staff to make sure that they are keeping up with this, whether that's budget constraints, right? 80 to about 150K in USD for a cybersecurity analyst. You also have education challenges, right? Where most jobs now, they need to be certified in specific areas, and that's not happening. So all of these resource limitations are pulling down MSPs, and the level of service in which they want to deliver, they're adopting MDR services, and we're seeing that. And a big piece of this is quality and speed, right? With threats nowadays, the one, identifying it quicker and being able to respond as quickly as possible is top of mind. And if you don't have the expertise on staff to be able to do that, you're increasing your risk for your customers to get hit and making that event what could have been minute to a much bigger case. I actually had an MSP the other day say, you know what, we don't need MDR services because I look at logs at the end of every week and we'll be good. So I'm thinking, okay, so say you do that on a Friday. So you're giving the threat actor basically a week to do what they want within your infrastructure. That's sort of the challenge that, me specifically having the pleasure of speaking with partners every day is sort of educating our partners on the goal here is to be an extension of your team, right? And with compliance and regulations not slowing down, right? You are supporting customers in a multitude of different verticals, right? Now are you going to hire someone that knows HIPAA, PCI like the back of their hand? No, you need to implement certain tools that allow you to be able to go to those regulations, provide the proof that you are doing the work for these customers. So one of the best questions I think Mark will touch on here is around the idea of, do I build, buy, or partner with an MDR service provider? Over the last 3 years, that's been my favorite, and I haven't had a good response from a partner to give me sort of why they should build it themselves. But the idea here is MDR is going to allow your organization to scale, become much more efficient, and protect your customers better than if you were to go out and try and build this yourself, right? It's cost and efficiencies all being driven here, right? And Mark and I can stand here and tell you, like, these are the challenges. that we're hearing from our partners, but the industry is saying the same thing, right? Canalys ran a study not too long ago, in May and June, where 54% of the MSPs say that talent and acquisition and retention is one of their worries that keeps them up all night. I've even seen where other studies that say 70% of MSPs, this is a worry for them, is how do I go out and capture talent? And now I'm spending the 80 to 150K a year, training them, getting them certified to have them just leave, right? So that's a big worry for them. Obviously, evolving threats, everyone knows this one. 50% of the respondents there said this is something they're trying to keep up with and they can't. And you're seeing the market shift, right? We're seeing high teens compound annual growth rate for the MDR market. They're expecting that's probably going to bump up to 25 to 30%. More than 60% of MSPs are now either evaluating it or already have MDR in place. So as far as competition, your competition is adopting these types of services, right? So understanding, okay, where you want to go and head down the road of acquiring new customers, but you also want to keep the customers that you have today with you, right? And MDR is a way to retain that talent. Because if you're not able to deliver it to them, they may go to another MSSP or MSP that is offering MDR. So enough from me. I want to pass it over to Mark, and I think what he's going to do is just give you an idea of some of maybe the confusion that's out in the marketplace around MDR and help sort of get our head around what that is, what that means. So Mark, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely, Marco. Thanks. And you really are kind of nailing the real challenge, right? Is that you have a growing threat landscape. As a sort of a echo response to that, you have the sort of regulatory, the other side of the vice that kind of comes in and says, okay, based on what we're seeing in the wild, here's what you need to do. And regulations don't, necessarily apply to those that we think of, typically, right? Like finance and healthcare as an example. That's true, right? Well established. But in other places, like think about things like auto dealers. Anyone who has any kind of financial touch now through the FTC has to have something like MDR. And they don't call it that, but effectively, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck is what they're really looking for. And so it's been a rise in both of those sides, both of the drive for those customers who, of course, are trying to meet this with limited budgets, limited resources, and in no way am I admonishing or denigrating what you are doing or what the customers are doing. But the simple fact is, if I look at the types of groups that I've gone against, organized criminal groups, nation state actors, they're well funded and they have more resources than you and I and probably our own governments have. And it's for this reason that analysts in the industry have talked about the rise of managed detection and response. So let's level set for a little bit. What do we mean by that? Effectively, it is a turnkey service that 24/7 monitors your environment, not just network, and looks for signs of suspicious activity or malicious activity. And when it finds it, when it's detected it, the job is to then respond. Now, that sounds simple, and it is, but the devil's in the details, right? Once we start to get into this, well, now we have lots of questions about, well, what are you detecting? And how are you detecting it? Are you using my security services that I've implemented and installed, or do you have a sort of a fixed menu of, let's say, firewalls, endpoints, cloud services, et cetera, that you protect? And therefore, I kind of have to fit your model. Otherwise, I'm still on the hook to detect certain things. Or maybe you don't do cloud, right? Maybe you're only looking at endpoint and network traffic, and you can't do anything outside the proverbial firewall. On the response side, there's the issue with things like, well, what is response? Is response finding something and sending an alert? Some companies would have argued, yes, that's it. So you're still on the hook of kicking the can the rest of the way down the road, right? They only pushed it part way. So you have to decide what to do. Or even on the response side, can they respond across your environment? And these are all the kind of things we're going to look at throughout the rest of this webinar. There's also a lot of confusion around, the alphabet soup that we see in cybersecurity, right? So there's MDR and EDR and SIM and XDR and SOAR and partridge in a pear tree. And we also to get to the point of like, well, how do they compare? Does one replace another? Is one an evolution of another? Things like that. And that's again something we'll deal with. Traditionally, MDR2 has meant that you've had to sacrifice control and visibility. So what I mean by that is when MDR kind of came on the scene, their job was to manage threats. And if we think about things before that, it was really about device management, right? Is my firewall up to date? Is it patched properly? Are the rules up to date? Are these other systems patched? We've, eliminated our vulnerabilities. And that sort of thinking was that sort of, the failed logic of, well, if everything preventative is set right, I should be good. Well, look, we spend billions, if not trillions, on cybersecurity, and we're constantly hit. So that's clearly a fallacy. So then it moves to, all right, just deal with the threats, right? I'm willing to hand over the keys to the kingdom, but I need you to make this go away. And that's kind of what MDR initially did. The problem is when you lack visibility and when you lack control, it sort of robs you of opportunities to proactively understand what's going on in your environment and make those changes to, in some ways, prevent the attacks from happening in the first place. And particularly for you as an MSP, you don't want to be the last one to know, right? You don't want the MDR vendor to go to the client and say, hey, we see something bad. There's interaction between the two. And then the client comes to you and says, hey, we found this thing. It's because we had this vulnerability. Why didn't you fix it? Or what could you do to fix it? And you're kind of sitting there flat-footed, not sure what's going on. So that lack of control, lack of visibility becomes a real challenge. And that really leads to the last piece, right? Which is the lack of MSP integration. Most of these services operate as a black box, and that is a problem both for the customer, as I've sort of elaborated here, and for the MSP. And we're going to dive further, so I don't want to kind of spoil all the goodness, but the reality is when it comes to MDR, while it looks like a simple kind of decision, it's not. There's a lot more that you kind of have to dig into, and it really is, important that you do your due diligence, right? There isn't a wrong answer here, but there is a right one. So it's really understanding fit, right? Understanding what you need, and then of course finding the proper match that complements your requirements, and that's going to make for a good partnership, a good marriage. Otherwise, you're going to find that, as we've seen many cases, you implement an MDR, and a year later, when you're out of contract, you're looking for a new one because it didn't work.
Awesome, thank you, Mark. And we're starting off with my favorite question of them all, which again, as we walk through these, keep these in mind, might write these down. These are some of the questions that we feel are important for you to ask yourself as you walk through your MDR journey and identifying, which partner you're going to go to market with. So, Mark, first question: do we buy or build MDR technology and services?
Yeah, that's probably the ultimate question, right? That's the beginning of the journey, right? The first step on the long journey. And you're right. So think about MDR as a scaled down version of what, let's say, large federal government agencies, major banks, insurers, Fortune 100 type of companies would have, right? An internal security operations center, a dedicated security team that manages all the equipment and the tools and technology that they have. So you have to ask yourself, at your scale, can you do that? Now, there's lots of numbers to get thrown out, but a typical number I see here is that the average annual cost of an in-house security operations center, and I'll get to this in a second, is somewhere around $2.5 to $3 million. And that's probably pretty accurate. In my career, I've built out SOC operations, right? We've done it twice, and it is costly. And because you need, one, there's the budget that I just talked about, but you need to hire in the experts. And you're probably looking at least a minimum of a dozen security experts at different tiers, right? So you're going to have some tier ones that do the basic stuff, that block and tackle, but then you're going to have, the tier twos and the tier threes that are more like a quarterback, that are the ones that truly have to understand what's happening, look at a bigger context, be able to dig in sort of more vicious sorts of attacks where there may be multiple vectors into the environment, where you're kind of doing, hand-to-hand combat, or there's somebody else on the other side of the attack, hands on keyboard, you're doing the same thing. So you've got to bring those people in, and that's a tough one, right? Because you have to recruit them, you have to train them and retrain them, and you have to retain them. And the reality is, particularly for smaller organizations, there is always somebody down the street willing to give them a 15, 20% raise, right? So that's a tough one. Even those big companies, those Fortune 100s, those major banks, they struggle with the same thing, right? It's sometimes they have a revolving door of staff because, they keep getting increases when they go to different places. You also have the technology and the scalability that you have to build out, right? So it's not easy to take all that information. Marco, I loved your comment earlier about the customer who, reviews their logs once a week. There's so much there, right? Well, okay,
Yes.
first of all, yeah, attacks occur in seconds and minutes. They don't occur in days or weeks or months. So, you're like you said, right? You've left probably most of the 7-day window is a window of exposure. But the other part is, well, what logs are you collecting and from where? And how frequently do you get them? And how do you prioritize them? And if you find something, because I always talk about this, everybody talks about the needle in the haystack. Well, when it comes to security and the real kind of attacks, the ones that become business disrupting, right? Those major data breaches, those major ransomware attacks, you're finding a needle in a stack of needles. And frankly, there's a stack of needles sitting in a field of a stack of needles. And that's the easy part. The hard part is knowing what to do with it when you find it. And as your business expands, right? So think about things like cloud-based services, remote work, industrial IoT. And when I say industrial, I don't just mean manufacturing. I'm talking about non-consumer IoT. I'm not talking about Ring doorbells and things like that. I mean where you have internet-connected devices that might be on a factory floor, or patient-worn medical devices or sensors or whatever it might be in, say, a utility or other kind of government facility. You have to be able to expand to see all that. So you got to ask yourself, can you do that within that budget? And let me just throw some numbers at you. To give you an idea, we see about 300 billion events a quarter across 3,000 plus customers. Of those, about 1 million are critical attacks. These are the ones that require the hands-on keyboards. You got to respond quickly. Yeah. So can you manage that, right? Can you deal with that? We see about 1 to 2 major attacks a week. These are the ones where it's all hands on deck, where multiple tiers of the SOC get involved. Can you do it? And can you respond in 30 seconds? Because that's what it takes. Can you contain these things in less than 15 minutes? Because that's what it takes to stop them from metastasizing through your environment. And then even after that, 30 minutes to just clean it all up. Can you do that every day? Is nobody going to take a break? They're never going to have a coffee. They're never going to take vacation. They're never going to have sick days. That's the real struggle. So most companies don't elect at the small to mid-size, even small enterprise do not elect to do this internally. They often move to an external vendor to provide the MDR service.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, cost aside, as an MSP, you're trying to understand too route to market. So what Mark just walked through, how long is that going to take an MSP if they do it perfect right from the start? Like you're looking over 12 months to maybe 2 years. And by that time, your customers may be going elsewhere, right? So that's obviously cost aside. So partnering with an organization that can help you provide MDR services gets you to market quicker and more efficiently and more effectively to go out and ultimately build your business as you move on. Great content, Mark. Okay, we're on to question 2. What are the core features of an MDR service provider?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about things like, now we talked about MDR, detection and response. So let's kind of break those down. There are the detection capabilities, the investigation capabilities, the response capability, and remediation. And within those are different factors that play. So detection, I kind of alluded to some of this already. How much of the environment can they see? Can they look at your network, perimeter defenses, gateways, cloud-based services, endpoints, any IoT connected devices, etc. So one, you have to be able to pull that in. That's the first part of the challenge. The second one you look at is how do they do that? Are they just aggregating alerts? So are they just bringing in effectively whatever any other system kicks out? I'll give you, again, a point on that 300 billion events. All those criticals were all the kind of things that didn't get detected by those systems. Again, it's not a criticism of those systems, but you can't detect everything. You're not going to stop everything in a implicit way. So the second part of detections comes down to artificial intelligence, to services like Uweebo, which is user and entity behavior analytics. So think of it like this. I've got one axis of my compass, right? Is let's call it the north-south traffic. Is all the the internet traffic, what goes in and out of your environment. The east-west traffic would be all the endpoint to endpoint things, right? Printers and laptops and email communications back and forth. And of course, they go outside to see your servers and all that kind of stuff. Just keep it simple. The z-axis or the z-axis is that third dimension. That's looking at the relationships between them all. So can you do that? Can you find the things that say, okay, well, this user looks legit. They're on a device that's legit coming in from a source, but now they're starting to do things that aren't normal for them. That's a potential detection. These are the things I call implicit, this is the inferential detections. That's where things like machine learning and AR are really good. So looking at things like remote access or remote administration tool takeovers, right? Common exfiltration activities, ransomware precursors, geofencing or impossible travel. There's all sorts of different factors you can look at, and we use about 20 to kind of figure out, again, where we don't have a blatant sign of something wrong, but there's something else going on that just looks wrong, that doesn't feel right, right? You kind of need your spidey senses here. And that's, or your gut, right? That's what you need to intuitively kind of look for other signs. Then when you investigate, are you pulling that information? Where do you pull that information from? How long does it take to investigate? Are you going to multiple sources, or is it all integrated in one place? And then on the response side, I think you need to break your response into two pieces. And you need to do this for scale and speed. One of them is autonomous responses. These are things like where I see the, like I said, implicit bad things. Someone's account has been compromised and we found their credentials in the dark web. Autonomously, we can set up rules to just reset a password. Or if we think it's severe enough, to disable their account access for a period of time until we can get to them and say, hey, is that really Marco? Is that really you in the Bahamas? You know, lucky you lying on a beach doing your work, exactly, right? Because it looks funny, right? So being able to do that kind of thing. Then the second side is the more surgical kind of implementation, which is the non-autonomous, where you work with the MSP, where you work with the customer and you say, this is pretty serious. We've got challenges here. We would recommend, based on what we see, disabling a device. But the problem is we don't want to, because we know that that device is critical in your infrastructure. It might cause a cascade effect and an outage. It might block services. Imagine a medical imaging server in a hospital. If we were to take that down, well, now you can't treat patients, and you may delay surgeries because they needed the MRI, the X-ray, or whatever it might be. So you really have to think about that stuff. Can they do that in a surgical way? Do they understand your business? As I've always joked, if you're talking about healthcare and somebody spells HIPAA with 2 Ps, validate their parking pass and send them on their way. And then the last piece is remediation, right? Is what can they fix? So often what I see with a lot of MDR vendors is they can do part of the response piece, but then the rest of it's like, yeah, now you need to update your firewall with these rules to block this attack so it can't happen again. And you need to update your endpoint to do this. And maybe you need to patch this vulnerability. And they're all sitting there going, I don't know what to do. And really that's where the MSP should be coming in. But often it becomes this hot potato, right? Where everyone's sort of struggling. And I think there, if you don't have a clean division of duty between all three parties, you're going to see a lot of problems, right? Because the MDR vendor is going to go to the customer and say, hey, you got to patch this system. And then if they don't tell the MSP because you don't have that control and visibility, you're in for a repeat attack. And of course, there's going to be an awful lot of finger pointing when that occurs.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm clearly biased, but from an MSP standpoint too, I think like multi-tenancy and fast and easy deployment through whatever RMM tool you have. And also on the flip side, like this idea of an open concept, right? Where whatever provider you choose isn't telling you, hey, you've made these investments over here, you now have to rip out even more tools to then add on MDR. So I think those are all sort of key features. And then moving on to the next one, on question 3, what are our top criteria for selecting an MDR provider?
Yeah, so I sort of set the baseline with question 2. Yep. So now I'll just kind of give you these are good questions just to ask verbatim, right? 1, sure. What security signals are you able to monitor and protect? This goes back to the breadth or the scope of the visibility. And honestly, if there's a dark part in your environment, guaranteed that's where bad guys are going to come in. Give you a quick example. We just dealt with a financial customer. They were attacked using fog, or which is a later variant of ransomware. Yep. And in that case, they attacked 6 devices which were being monitored by Microsoft Defender, or had Microsoft Defender on them. They were not monitored by us. So we didn't see all that inferential stuff that I was talking about. They were able, but as soon as they touched one of the points, the devices that we were monitoring in their environment, we caught it right away. In fact, we caught it within seconds and stopped it. Those other devices were locked down. So that's a bit messy, but the reality is, this is why it's important to know, can they see everything, right? Where are they pulling from? What metrics and reporting do they help, or do they offer to help your organization effectively track and understand your security posture? So a lot of what security does is going to help you with things like risk assessments, compliance standards, et cetera. So what can you look at? Can they tell you, like, here's the top 10 things, man, you've got a noisy environment. If you just invested in this technology, you could, by 90% reduce the amount of threats you're seeing. Get more proactive here. Don't just be responsive to everything that's coming through your door. That's messy and dirty, and eventually, someone's going to make a mistake, right? You're going to leave something vulnerable and somebody's going to get in and exploit it. Other things are, I talked about visibility in your environment. Regulatory industries, this is another one. What kind of reporting do you provide, right? Most companies, or many companies, are going to have to deal with the alphabet soup of financial regulators. For HIPAA with healthcare, PCI if you're managing credit card data. You may be looking at NIST standards, or you might say, well, how do we map to 171 as an example, or ISO, or whatever it might be. CMMC is another big one if you're, if you deal with FedRAMP and government, federal government, DoD contractors and vendors as customers, right? So what have they got baked in? What about things like compliance reporting? Can I see things like stale accounts, invalid passwords, any GPO policy violations, simple things like that? And I know it doesn't sound fancy, and it's not, but at the end of the day, it's the brushing and flossing of security, right? If you're catching a lot of that stuff, you're going to prevent many of these attacks, because as I always say with bad guys, even the sophisticated threat actors are still using very rudimentary tactics and techniques, right? So it's still things like phishing to compromise or to steal credentials. They're using remote administrative tools or exploiting PowerShell to get in. None of this is in terms of security. Like for us, we see this every day, right? So it's pretty common for us to see, but it's how they put that together, right? I use this quick analogy. It's the master chef, right? They could walk into your kitchen and they could take chicken and some vegetables and some oils and whatever, and they could cook you this delicious meal. And why did they do that? Because it's the same ingredients that you buy every day, right? It was in your fridge. It's because they have that mastery of putting it all together and understanding it. That's what criminals can do. So you want to make sure that you can plug those basic holes. And then another piece of this is how do they provide scalability and flexibility, right? Because the reality is what you see today is not what you're gonna have tomorrow, right? So, in banking, maybe you bring on new online marketing services. In healthcare, you've got new patient wearable devices. Manufacturing, the same thing, connecting your factory floor to your front office, all that kind of stuff, right? And when it comes to the detection part, what machine learning are they using? How are they catching those inferential signs of badness? I think for me, that's just a huge one. And then lastly, because I know we got to watch our time here, is I'm going to say the big one here is how do they interact with the customers in the MSP? How do they interact with you, right? So what's their customer support look like? Do they have an assurance department that works with you, that helps with things like specialized reporting or answering questions for you? Or are they just doing the tactical tackling and blocking, and that's kind of it, and they're not willing to help you with any of the sort of strategic work that you might? So you really want to kind of challenge that and understand how they work, because what you'll see from a tier 1 SOC analyst dealing with basics is not what you want to expect from a team leader or tier 3. And then also, like I said, just looking at everything that's happening in your environment monthly, quarterly, and understanding what can we do to lower the noise, right? To reduce the noise in your environment so that everyone focuses on signal. And ultimately, from a business perspective, that's about understanding and justifying why you put your budget where you do, right? You can use that to qualify why you need to spend, and you can use it to demonstrate the value or the return on investment that you get from it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And moving on to question number 4. This one is also one of my favorite ones here is how do we evaluate MDR providers?
Yeah, so for me, I look at, everyone's going to look at price. Absolutely, sure. Right? So, do they price by, generally it's by user or device or some combination of those. So that's going to be one of the factors. The second thing would be, like I said, going back to those, what are they detecting? What are they responding? How can they respond, et cetera? But the big piece that I use here is what kind of demonstrations can you do, right? Can you do an actual demo? Can they see the environment? Is there some kind of proof of concept, proof of value? And, can the MSP run it for a period of time and evaluate and make sure that it's sort of customized to what you need? Those are big questions that I would ask. And frankly, where I get wary is when an MSP just has slideware, right? Where they just tell stories. I mean, stories are great. I love them way better than statistics, because stories, they get to us. They have a personal context that are relevant to us. So it's way better to, talk about a ransomware attack in a similar firm than it is to give you, statistics where we all go, well, that's terrible. We drink our coffee and we get on with our day. Yeah. But I want to see it in my environment. You want to be able to kick the tires in your environment. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to test the interaction between you, the MDR player, and the MSP, and your MSP, I should say. But the other thing it does is make sure that it's like I said, that it's delivering what you need. Are they catching the things you need? When they do, and there's an investigation, are they logging and, creating the right level of forensics that you require, whether that's just an internal report to a stakeholder like, hey, we saw this thing happen and this is what happened, or here's why we had to disable these devices or these accounts, or is it something more serious where, you have to collect all that information for a regulator, as an example, whether that's an annual exam or you have to provide some kind of attestation, whatever it might be. And why I always say it's important to evaluate that is one of the big things that I see with regulatory investigations is a search for consistency, right? So when you saw a suspicious activity A of some nature, you took action X. When you saw suspicious activity of something similar to it, you took action Y. Well, why was that? In this one case, you rebooted a system. In this other case, you didn't. Or you disabled an account. In this other case, you didn't. It's not to say it's wrong, but you want to have the right answer, right? You want to be able to say, well, we didn't disable that device because of its criticality in our environment and it would cause a service disruption. So we elected to deal with the threat for a period of time. Here's how we provided air cover. In another case, to say, well, that's straightforward, right? That was an EV account, password reset. We forced the person to re-authenticate. What was the pain? 15 seconds in loss? It's worth it. But you have to be able to be consistent in that kind of thing.
Yeah. One thing I do want to highlight too is you mentioned sort of POV, POC. Right. You also want a clear understanding of what that POV or POC actually is going to do. And is it just software? Or is it also the 24/7 SOC as well? So, ideally, does that POV help you identify things within your network that you weren't privy of, right? That will help you eventually close the gaps that could lead to a bigger situation down the road, right? So those are some of the things that I've seen work in sort of the questions asking MDR providers. So we'll move on to our last question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, sorry, Mark. I was going to say you're bang on with that, right? Like, look, when anybody gets into your environment and they turn on the lights, we should expect to find things unwanted in the corners, right? Like in the shadows. That is normal. Again, that's not a criticism of your environment or the job that you're doing as a customer or as an MSP. It's always going to happen. And you're right. If they're not finding anything, or you're running pen tests and they're not detecting it, it's stuff like that you want to see. And even that you might want to tune, right? You might want to say, yeah, I don't want to know about port scanning. Like, yeah, put that in a report. That's boring. But I do want to know about this stuff. So it just helps you sort of tune for your environment so that when if you do go live, right, then like you say, right, it's like flipping a switch. It's seamless and you're off to the races versus spending, now you're paying, you're into the program, and you're going to spend the next 3 months actually trying to tune and focus the service because it wasn't exactly what you thought it was going to be.
Right. And I think the POV allows you to, especially the partner, the prospect, right, really understand what that onboarding process looks like. And that onboarding process and the engagement you get with the team is going to tell you a lot about sort of the post-sale experience as well.
Right.
All right. Question 5. Last, but definitely not least, how do we partner with our selected MDR vendor?
Again, we've sort of alluded to some of these pieces before, but really it is a partnership, right? The MDR player does not replace the MSP. Now, there's lots of different ways to do this too, just from a business model, right? Are you white labeling as an example, right? Are you, like with Enable MDR, for example, you're not. You're bringing that in as part of your service offering. So, that's what we're talking about today. So how do you do that? Who's responsible for what? So like I said, what is the division of duty? What kind of calls, flags, and run books do you need in place to say when these certain things occur, when you detect something, when you have to take specific action, here's what we want to be notified of, what we don't want to be notified of. And then also your MDR vendor should have some kind of portal, gateway, or access point to allow the MSP direct insight into what's going on. So for example, with Enable MDR, you can see what's happening, right? What the customer sees is what the SOC sees, is what the MSP sees and in real time. So you want to be able to do that again, because of, as I said, that's the reactive side of it. But you also want to be able to run those reports. Like I said, you as the MSP have that opportunity to provide the proactive business insights, to be able to go in and say, look, here's what we see in your environment. Here's the noisiest things. Here's, your top 10 list of Sir Click-a-lots. And, what do we recommend around these sort of vulnerabilities of ways you can help. So having access to that information, and also for the, for the MDR vendor to understand what their role is, right? To say, look, our job is within this window. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to find these things. We're going to take action on them. We're going to report on it. And we're going to keep you in the loop. And as the MSP, you know where you're stepping in, right? You know where it's about things like I said, configuration, making sure that if there's updates, patching, that those kind of things are done. If there's a proactive upsell or cross-sell, that that's where you step in. The MDR vendor shouldn't be doing any of that kind of stuff, right? They're the ones to provide, as I always say, they're the ones to provide the evidence or the data behind those decisions. But it's always the MSP. It's you're the one that owns the relationship. So I think that's what really needs to be established, rather than the MDR vendor going, oh, hey, if you just bought this extra thing from us, you'd be so much better. And now it's at a cross conflict. And I've also seen a lot of that with MDR versus MSPs, where there's conflict in the channel, where you have direct sales fighting with with channel sales. They're trying to upsell a service or licensing through them versus through the MSP, and that actually kind of often goes back to the philosophical model of MDR. There's two, there was sort of an evolutionary split way back, right? One branch was we will have a proprietary stack, right? We're going to take that best in breed. We're going to buy the best of, endpoint and firewalls and cloud, and we're going to put all that together, and that's all we monitor. You have to have that, otherwise we can't help you. And then you have the other agnostic kind of approach, which is the enable MDR approach, which is we support all these different things, right? We support these different endpoints and firewalls and operating systems and cloud-based services, et cetera. And so really then it's about pulling that together to protect it. And the reason that's important, like I said, is if you've kind of got that proprietary model, well, then the problem is you're always going to be in a bit of a competitive position, because that MDR vendor is getting money for reselling those licenses, whether they're Microsoft Defender, like E3 licenses, whether they're CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or whatever. And then that becomes, like I said, that's going to create channel confusion. And those SOC operators, they don't know. They're not necessarily going to know. So they're going to be like, hey, if you had this endpoint or you've upgraded to this other service, this would have helped in this situation. So they write that in a report that goes to a customer. And then, you're in this, like I said, you're in this indirect competition, and we don't want that, right? You really do want harmony between all three parties, because I look at it from a customer perspective. One, I don't want two sales calls. That's just going to annoy me. But more importantly, I don't want two different people that I trust implicitly telling me different things, right? I want a single source of truth, and I want one voice, and that one voice is the MSP.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about this being a true partnership, right? And we've obviously had a very clear focus on what partners should be asking when it comes to MDR. But I also want to just highlight a couple things when you're looking at a vendor. It's for most of the MSPs that I get to speak with, this MDR service is completely new to them, right? So they're sort of jumping into this, and they already have built contracts, and they already have pricing, and they've already increased prices. So delivering a new service to the market can be challenging and daunting in some cases. So what I'm trying to get at is you want to make sure you partner with an organization that, one, understands your business, two, understands where you're headed, and can help you, right? Give you options in terms of, how do I go to my customers today with this service, because we know, right, they need it, we want it, we want to deliver it to them to increase the cyber resiliency within our customer base. So truly having that partnership and understanding of how we can help our partners go to market with these new services and what types of resources that we can provide to them. Great.
That's all right.
Yes. So enable MDR. Obviously, Mark's dove into a little bit of this earlier, but enable MDR, we luckily partnered with Adlumin. There were a number of reasons why we chose Adlumin. We wanted to make sure that, obviously, we support MSPs and we also support direct customers, but we needed to make sure that it addressed a lot of the efficiencies that help our partners go to market, right? Quick, fast, easy deployment. We're not ripping out their existing investments, right? We're sort of wrapping around what they've put into place, and we're capturing security telemetry from endpoints, from cloud, from network. So making sure that it's multi-tenanted from a management standpoint, right? And we support different MSPs. Not every MSP is the same, right? So we have smaller 2-3 man shops, but we also have very large MSPs. So the scale and maturity of the MSPs we're working with is across the board. So we needed to understand and make sure that we selected a partner that allowed us to deliver the services to our partners no matter where they are in their security journey. So a lot of great things. We've almost coming up about a year now with the partnership, and very excited, myself along with 2 other colleagues that support the globe on speaking with our customers and partners from a day-to-day perspective. But that's sort of the high-level overview of what we're able to provide. I think we're going to give it over to Mark, and clearly he's the much smarter one, so he'll dive into sort of the nuts and bolts of how this all works.
Hardly, Marco, but yeah, let's go through this. Okay, so when I talked about, again, the visibility, right? How much of your environment can you see? We are collecting from your network, your cloud services, endpoints that you have, EDR services you might have, remote access, so things like gateways, VPNs, SD-WAN, et cetera. Your employees, so we can look at Azure, right? So we can see the users and the groups, all of the security nodes that you have, firewalls, whatever they might be, UTMs, and then of course your system logs as well. So we can pull all of that information. We do all of that through native APIs. We have nearly 200 APIs that are pulling from those services, and we also have a syslog collector, so we can also pull those. All of that information comes in and is enhanced, and we do that in two ways. First, we include dark web monitoring. So we're looking at things like critical docs, critical accounts, credentials, et cetera. So we're just monitoring for those to see if we spot them in markets, dark markets. Now, on top of that, we have a dedicated threat research team. And I love our threat research team because the manager of that team, the director, he came from the NSA, and he is I don't know if this is, I'm going to age myself here, but the old movie War Games with Matthew Broderick, where he hacks into like the nuclear command system. He didn't quite go that far, but he hacked into his school environment, and in his K-12 district, they caught him and they kind of went, look, you're a bit of a genius. Nobody wants to see you in prison. Let's put you in the military. So they got him, put him in a special program. He graduated. He went through military college, and then he ended up in the NSA. He has spent his life in the dark corners of the world that you and I don't want to see. And so he and his team are both pulling in generic threat feeds. So, subscriber feeds from the government and other proprietary sources, but they're also going out and doing their own research. They're in those environments, those chat rooms, those, like I say, dark corners of the markets of the world that we don't know exist. And they're taking all of that information and they're combining it with what we're pulling from that step 1 collection sources. So part of that is, well, hey, if now I understand what bad guys are doing here. I see this sort of collection of tactics they might use. Can I find that pattern in what's happening? But then that information also informs the 3rd stage of detection. So they work with our data science engineers to help them say, here's what we see, here's what we need to do about it. How do you do it? Like, how could you detect that? So they build out, like I said, we have about 20 now different machine learning based algorithms that specifically look for what I would call the choke points of attacks. And then we also provide compliance insights that come out of it. And then we're hunting, right? So this is what our SOC is doing. They are looking for those threats. So they're not just taking alerts and detections, but they're proactively kind of going through the environment, looking for those inferential signs that something's wrong. And when they find them, they investigate. And then we get to the step 5, or the contain, right? Where we get into the red part. This is where it gets really critical. We've found something bad. They will respond within 15 seconds. They're investigating. Within 15 minutes, they have resolved it. So their job is to go through that, to contain it in the multiple different ways that I talked about. We can do that across accounts. So, anything like a password reset to disabling. We can do that across devices as well, so endpoints. We can also do it on threads, and that's important, on processes. And that's important because if I go back to that example of, say, a medical imaging suite, if I shut down that endpoint, you lose the services that are running or depend upon it. But if I can backtrack a ransomware attack to specific threads, then I can just kill those, right? I can kill those processes, and I've left the rest of the system running. So think of it like a surgery, right? I can take out the diseased part of the area of the body with a clean margin, and I can get rid of it, and I know it can't spread anymore. And then, of course, we can block cloud-based access to those services, and also any remote access like a VPN, et cetera. When all of that's done, we're going to be notifying you real time and generating tickets so that you can track this activity. But then we're going to remediate. So we can do some system patching, and we can set up new policies and rules. So once we find this stuff, remember I said sometimes that's a challenge for the customer, we can automatically do that. We can just push those new detection rules out to your customer services, so their firewall, whatever it might be. And then we're also, of course, as a byproduct of that is the full reporting. So you have the dashboard. You can see exactly what's going on. You can dive into any detection and see exactly why was this one closed as false positive versus why was this one investigated and contained. And all of the reporting just automatically flows out of that. All of this is real time. So any reporting, whatever you look at in the portal, in the dashboard, is exactly what's happening at that second. You are seeing it as the analyst does it. You might as well be standing over their shoulder as they're doing an investigation. So it gives you that, one, confidence that these attacks or these suspicious activities are being dealt with. But then two, like I said, you have the evidence afterwards to prove what I call duty of defense, or what an insurer would call that. So let's assume something did happen, or it's something reportable. Or you just have to show activity over the year. You've got all of that automatically generated for your regulator. You can press print, and there it is as a PDF, or you can pull it in other formats. You can also, for an insurer, if there was something you wanted to do, like you did want to make a claim, and I don't think I've seen one yet, but if you did, you've got all the information you require. One, to show that you had the right security in place. Two, that you took action when you detected something and you did it rapidly to contain it. And here's the evidence, because those are the kind of things they're going to look for.
Awesome. Mark, I'm going to bring it up, and I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot, but I think this is a layup.
Yeah.
You, in your sort of view, like, what's the difference between XDR and MDR?
Yeah, absolutely. So XDR is the platform, right? XDR is the combination of what I'd call SIM and SOAR. So SIM is your logging system, right? MSPs are going to know that. And then it's married or coupled with a SOAR capability. SOAR is security, orchestration, automation, and response. So that's the XDR part. Think of it like the foundation, right? It's the integrated tool set that MDR is going to use. So then MDR is the analysts, the experts, the threat intelligence groups, the data scientists, all of that are feeding into that platform. So XDR is really, not only is it the foundation, I'd say it's really the kind of the accelerator, right? It's the thing that optimizes, that allows you to scale, allows you to pull in from all these sources and grow your business, but it also streamlines or accelerates the response capability. So XDR, it's tool. It's just like any other managed system, managed EDR or managed SIM or whatever you want to say. You need the MDR expertise on top of it to know what to do with it. It's going to find the needle in the haystack. In some cases, it's going to automate or autonomously respond. But then the reality is, the real dangerous things, that's the things that take or require the human touch. That's MDR.
So to throw more alphabet soup, because I've also seen this out in the marketplace as MXDR. We would qualify sort of Illumin as an MXDR platform as well.
Absolutely. This is a bit like the problem in security, or I guess in IT in general, is you don't have like governing bodies. It's not like just to call yourself a doctor, you have to have certain credentials, right?
Yep.
Anybody can kind of say they're whatever they are. And I'm not saying they're right out there making it up, but it's a broad definition, right? It's not a tightly defined definition. So they can kind of, and they'll play it for whatever marketing purposes. And that's not saying they're doing something wrong. They're just trying to position their strengths. And so, you're going to hear a lot of these terms confused as the same thing, but effectively it's the same.
Yeah. And I love this slide because it also highlights, one of the reasons why we chose Illumin to go to market with is because you're consolidating all these services, whether it's SOAR, SIM,
absolutely,
XDR, from covering multiple different vectors.
That's right.
Reporting, right? We had an MSP that normally ran a report. His team ran a report, took them 2 hours per month, and within 2 clicks, they got the information they normally had to spend that 2 hours on. So, great slide. Appreciate it.
Hey, Marco, good point on that too, is there are custom reports, which I didn't talk about. So within the 100%. Reporting, you get the regulatory ones, which I've touched on multiple times. You also have all the executive kind of reporting, like, what security actions are being taken. But then you can do custom reports. So you can set those up, and we do actually offer so many hours of that, I believe, comes in with the service. So you can, effectively say, if there's something, specific to your business, specific to the way your stakeholders want to see things, you need to see things to run your business, whatever it is, we also build that for you.
Yes. Great job, Mark. Also, for our partners that have joined, and Jay's going to hold you all honest. If you want to learn more about Enable MDR powered by Lumen, obviously reach out to Enable8, and we'd love to sit down, have a discussion, and explore it a little bit further. But we also, I think Jay's putting up a poll here as well. If you wouldn't mind just filling this out quickly. I think we have about 40 left. Jay, do you want us to answer these as well?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat at this time, and we will definitely
handle the Q&A. Great.
Got one more poll as well. Sorry, but yeah. So I would highly encourage you all to reach out. Having that POV, right? Being able to trial this. I'm not on all the calls, but I've sat in on some and listened to some of the recordings. It's an amazing opportunity for you if you don't have an NDR service, right? To try it out. Mm-hmm. And if you already have one, compare it, right? Side by side, right? So that's a great opportunity as well, because we know there's, like both gentlemen mentioned, there's a lot of different variations of these services out there. And this will give you the opportunity to compare and contrast.
Okay, good.
Let me just close.
I also see we got some questions that are popping in, which is great. Jay, where do you want them to put those questions, by the way? In the chat, or is there a questions piece?
Yeah, you can do the questions. That's fine.
Okay.
Yep. I'm multiple screens. If you guys see them, if you don't mind answering, Marco. If you don't mind.
We'll run with it.
Yeah. Please, thank you.
First question, Mark. We've seen within the market a number of MDR providers being labeled as black box providers. Could you sort of elaborate on the difference between a black box provider and what Lumen delivers?
Yeah, definitely. So the black box provider, when I talk about that evolutionary split, they're kind of that first proprietary set. And often the reason they're black box is that sort of generation one MDR player, often some of the big names, they don't have the capability to separate their SOC activities from their sort of like the XDR platform, right? The reporting part. So the reason they're a black box is when they talk about things like a single pane of glass, it's really not. It's a single monitor screen with 18 different windows open. So, different detection, alert systems. And, so for example, if they're managing an endpoint for you, they're logging into that endpoint, and then they're looking at your log, your syslogs, and they're looking over here at other sources. And then they have to cut and paste all that information. And so it's a bit of a black box, because if you were to ask a question like to say, hey, I've got a board meeting coming up, can you run us some, spin us up some data to show them what we're doing and what you guys are doing? They've got to manually go to all those places. Or if you say, look, we just, my CEO just read about this ransomware attack and they want to know if that could happen to us, or, or is it in our environment? Something along those lines. I see that a lot. They've got to go and manually pull from all those different places, put it together. So when I talk about it being a black box, generally it's that you might have a concierge, you might have a key contact, a 1-800 number that you call to get into the SOC, but you can't see what they're doing. One of the things that Lumen has done is to make it open, right? To have that sort of transparent view of all the information. Like I said, you can see the portal, you can see what's going on in the SOC analysts, you see exactly what the SOC department or the SOC team sees. Same thing with the MSP, and that's why it's critical to have that. Is I think those were one of the big challenges. Often too, that comes to the fact that the MDR vendor cannot support multi-tenancy. So, for example, if an MSP says, hey, I want to see data from all of my customers, they've got to manually pull that for each one, because there isn't a place where all of that is just harmonized, where you can get that kind of group sort of view, and that's why they're black box.
Awesome. The next question is, when responding to attacks, what is the division of duty between the MSP and MDR provider?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, MDR is they should be the Navy SEAL team. Their job is, of course, to do the detection. Their job is to do the investigation and can run it to ground and then contain it. Some of the remediation activities may fall on the MSP. Like I said, depending on what it is, there may be work with, if it's not something the MDR vendor can patch or we can patch, then it's, like let's say it's Citrix, Citrix that has a whatever vulnerability or CCD or CVV, and you need to patch that. The MSP is going to do that. There may be other pieces too, where I look at sort of complementary services. Let's say it's awareness training. You see somebody is one of the big causes. The MSP that gives you the opportunity to offer that kind of service and provide that, and you can do that with or without the MDR player, right? I do a lot of that now, actually, where with the MSP, I just do executive briefings. So it's not selling enable MDR. It's just going in and going, look, here's what I see in the environment. Here's what's going on, and not just threats, but legal actions, right? Court settlements, regulatory changes. Like, I want to give you that fiduciary view of the world to help, help the sort of executive layer understand what's happening. But yeah, it is, like I said, it's a partnership. It's not like MDR just takes over and does everything soup to nuts. They're dealing, let's call it threat management. That's their job. The rest of it, like device management, customer management, all of that is really that's still the MSP.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the whole idea around roles and responsibilities, right? So when you're evaluating the vendor, like, have a clear understanding of where their service stops and where you, the MSP, now has to go ahead and bring that value to the customer.
Exactly.
Awesome. Next question we have is, how are the MSP informed of those customer attacks, and are they during or after the attack?
Good question. So there are both, I guess, or I guess if that's the case, it's during. So the MSP is provided notifications through their portal as well, and the ticketing system. So it's all there. It's, like I said, it's not a black box. It is transparent. It is live, real time, I should say, so you can see what's happening. And certainly as part of the rules of engagement, so this is kind of partially division of duties, but we set up those kind of rules, right? So it might be, let's say, a high priority customer that you have, or if it's specific accounts or specific services, whatever it might be that you think is critical and important to your business, then we make sure that there's additional notifications, like that kind of thing, so that you're kept up to speed. Because, like I said, the last thing I want is your customer calls you after the fact and says, hey, we need to do something about this thing that just occurred, and you're trying to tap dance because you don't know what they're talking about.
Yep. Great. Another question. I think this is a really good one. I get asked this a lot, is when deploying the MDR agent, do you have a choice in terms of what machines to put the agent on? Meaning, should they do their entire estate, or should they do just quote unquote important devices? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm obviously, people are going to say that I'm biased, obviously, but look, the reality is it should be on all devices, because 100%. I gave you that example of the fog ransomware attack. Criminals are extremely good at figuring out what's running resident on in an environment, trying to disable those systems or roll them back so that the database level that, say, your endpoint has is out of date and won't detect their specific rootkit that they're using. That's pretty common, and so often what we see is those systems get attacked, and then it's when they hit a monitored system. So it isn't a simple, like, let's only worry about what's important. Think about it like supply chain, right? We've seen this over the years. Just because you might be a supplier way down the chain, you're a great vector into somebody who's more critical in that ecosystem, or an employee. You might say, well, it's just a junior employee, they don't have access to critical things. Yeah, but if we compromise their account, I could probably use that to compromise someone's, someone more not important, but somebody with higher privileges, right? Whether it's someone with executive level or someone with administrative credentials, things like that. So it's just better to lock everything down.
Yeah, and just to expand on that too, is as an MSP, you're paying. The value that MDR services bring are the ability to collect as much data and all the data throughout your network to then take action on an event, right? And if you're not putting it out on all those machines, you're limiting the SOC to be able to do what you're essentially paying them to do. So yes, 100% on all of those devices. So right there with you, Mark. And I know we're at the top of the hour. Mark, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure doing this webinar with you. I myself learned a bunch of information from you, and look forward to continuing our partnership. If anyone has any questions following this, please don't hesitate to reach out to your Enableite, and look forward to speaking to a number of you throughout the coming weeks. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Marco.